Before their stories ever intersect in imagination, before readers begin to compare their symbols and their burdens, the worlds of Superman and Spider-Man already stand as two very different landscapes of heroism. Each is built on a distinct psychological terrain, shaped by different cultural anxieties, different moral expectations, and different visions of what power does to a human life. Their cities reveal this difference immediately. One is a skyline that looks upward, a horizon of steel and sunlight where flight feels natural. The other is a labyrinth of rooftops and alleys, where movement is horizontal, improvised, and precarious. Metropolis rises like a monument to aspiration. Its architecture implies belief in structure, in clarity, in a future that can be built with intention. Superman moves through that skyline as if gravity itself has been renegotiated. He is visible, not merely as a body in motion, but as a stabilizing presence. His arrival resolves tension before it becomes chaos. A falling aircraft, a collapsing bridge, a war of machines in the sky. The pattern is familiar. A crisis appears, and then something greater descends through the clouds. New York, as Spider-Man experiences it, tells a different story. It is not a city that waits for resolution. It pushes. It crowds. It demands movement through narrow corridors of responsibility and accident. The skyline still exists, but Peter Parker rarely stands above it. He swings through it, tied to it by strands that must constantly be recreated. Every movement requires contact with the environment. Every step is negotiation. Where Superman seems to rewrite gravity, Spider-Man survives by cooperating with it. Even before examining their lives, these environments reveal something about the psychology each hero embodies. Superman represents the possibility that power can stabilize a world that feels fragile. His presence suggests a moral center capable of holding the system together. Spider-Man represents something more volatile, a life lived inside instability, where responsibility arrives before wisdom and power must be managed through improvisation rather than authority. Both figures emerged from very different cultural moments. Superman first appeared during an era when the world was confronting the collapse of old structures. Economic depression, geopolitical uncertainty, and the rise of new technologies had created a psychological climate where people looked upward for reassurance. The figure who descended from the sky carried not only physical strength, but symbolic gravity. He suggested that order could still exist above the chaos of human systems. Spider-Man arrived decades later in a different cultural atmosphere. The world had grown more skeptical of authority, more aware of institutional fragility, and more attentive to the contradictions of everyday life. Power no longer appeared exclusively as salvation. It appeared as burden. Responsibility was not a cosmic calling, but an immediate consequence of small decisions. The figure who swung through the city did not stand above it. He was entangled in it. These two heroes represent two different psychological answers to the same question. What does power do to a person who did not ask for it? Superman's story begins with distance. A child arrives from another world, carrying the memory of a civilization that no longer exists. His survival is an accident of cosmic scale, yet the environment that receives him is patient. Rural landscapes, quiet fields, a household that believes strength must be disciplined by humility. By the time he emerges into public view, the foundation of his identity has already been shaped by restraint. Spider-Man's story begins with proximity. A teenager in a crowded city acquires power through a moment that feels almost trivial. A bite, an accident, no prophecy, no cosmic migration. The transformation occurs inside ordinary life. There is no time to construct a moral framework before the consequences arrive. The system shifts overnight, and the city does not slow down to help him understand what has changed. These origins create two distinct psychological rhythms. Superman grows into his power slowly, learning to contain it within an ethical architecture that precedes his public identity. Spider-Man discovers power suddenly, without preparation, and must build his ethical structure while already in motion. In many ways, they represent opposite relationships with control. Superman's power appears limitless, yet his identity is built around limitation. Every action requires restraint. Every rescue must avoid collateral damage. His strength is balanced by a constant awareness that one miscalculation could alter the structure of the world itself. Spider-Man's power appears modest by comparison, yet his life is defined by escalation. Problems multiply faster than he can solve them. One decision triggers another crisis. The tension rarely resolves. His identity is built through constant adjustment rather than equilibrium. The difference between them is not merely physical capability. It is perspective. Superman stands above the system and sees the whole structure. Spider-Man stands inside the system and feels its pressure from every direction. One operates like a stabilizing force within a gravitational field that threatens collapse. The other moves like a thread through a network that constantly tightens around him. For decades, audiences have imagined what would happen if these two figures could observe each other not as competitors, but as mirrors. What would the man who carries the weight of a planet learn from the young man who carries the weight of everyday life? What would the boy who swings through consequences discover in the calm gravity of a figure who rarely loses control? Because beneath the spectacle of costumes and superhuman feats lies something more revealing. Two different models of responsibility. Two different strategies for surviving power. Two myths shaped by different eras, yet orbiting the same question. What does it mean to be strong in a world that never stops testing the limits of that strength? Their stories rarely collide directly. They belong to different narrative universes, different editorial histories, different mythologies of heroism. Yet culturally they occupy the same symbolic arena. Readers and viewers instinctively compare them, not because their abilities overlap, but because their moral architectures feel complementary. Superman embodies stability. Spider-Man embodies struggle. Superman represents the possibility that strength can remain pure. Spider-Man represents the reality that strength often arrives too late to prevent damage. Both carry hope, but they carry it in radically different ways. And somewhere inside that difference lies a deeper tension. A tension that has quietly shaped how generations of audiences understand responsibility, heroism, and the cost of living under the constant pressure of expectation. If these two figures could study one another across the boundaries of their stories, the lesson would not be about combat or superiority. It would be about perspective. The man who sees the world from above might discover something about the value of living inside it, and the young hero who never escapes the weight of consequence might glimpse the possibility of standing above the chaos long enough to understand it. Two myths, two gravitational centers in the landscape of modern storytelling. Their paths rarely cross, but their questions do, and the answers they carry for one another reveal something profound about the psychology of heroism itself. Before any comparison between them can carry meaning, it becomes necessary to return to the origins of the worlds that produced them. Not merely the fictional events of their lives, but the deeper narrative soil from which they emerged. Superman and Spider-Man are not simply characters within stories. They are responses to cultural pressure, symbolic constructions that reveal what different eras believed about power, responsibility, and the human capacity to endure moral weight. Superman enters the narrative landscape as a being who arrives already displaced from his origin. His story begins with loss that precedes memory, a planet destroyed, a civilization erased, a child launched into the unknown before he can understand what has vanished. This initial rupture creates a paradox that shapes everything that follows. Superman is both immigrant and survivor. He carries no personal memory of Krypton, yet his entire existence is defined by the fact that it is gone. This distance from origin produces a peculiar psychological clarity. Superman grows up without nostalgia for a world he cannot remember. His sense of belonging is built entirely within the environment that adopts him. The Kansas farmland that receives him offers something rare in mythic narratives: stability without spectacle, a place where strength is not celebrated but contained. The lessons of restraint arrive early. Do not show what you can do. Do not frighten others. Do not let power define who you become. This childhood shapes the internal architecture that later allows Superman to exist in public view without collapsing under the pressure of visibility. His powers expand gradually. Strength increases. Vision extends. Hearing penetrates deeper into the surrounding world. Each new ability forces an ethical negotiation. How much intervention is acceptable? How much distance must remain? The result is a moral discipline that becomes the central gravity of his identity. Clark Kent is not a disguise in the conventional sense. It is the environment where that discipline was formed. The quiet figure who walks through Metropolis carrying notebooks and asking questions represents the human scale that anchors the extraordinary force above the skyline. Without that foundation, the figure in the sky would become abstract, detached from consequence. Spider-Man emerges from a far more immediate environment. Peter Parker's origin contains no cosmic distance. His world is already crowded with pressure before his transformation occurs. A small apartment, financial instability, social isolation. The city does not wait for him to become extraordinary. It already demands survival. The moment that grants him power arrives without ceremony. A bite during a school visit, a sudden shift in physical capability. Strength appears where vulnerability once existed. Yet the psychological structure required to manage that change has not yet formed. There are no years of quiet training, no parental instruction designed to regulate the impact of unusual abilities. Instead, the first experiment with power produces tragedy. The decision to ignore a small act of violence leads directly to irreversible loss. The death of Uncle Ben does not function as narrative ornament. It becomes the central fracture in Peter Parker's moral universe. Responsibility is no longer an abstract principle. It is an equation written in absence. Every action now echoes against the memory of the moment when action was withheld. This difference between them becomes crucial. Superman learns restraint before his power becomes public. Spider-Man learns responsibility only after power has already escaped his control. The structure of their identities reflects this divergence. Superman's public presence appears calm, almost architectural in its stability. He arrives where disaster threatens to break the structural integrity of the world. The airplane in free fall, the city collapsing under alien machinery, the war that threatens planetary survival. His interventions resemble reinforcement of foundations. Spider-Man's presence appears reactive. Problems emerge within environments that are already unstable. Crime syndicates shift power. Scientific experiments rupture the boundary between knowledge and catastrophe. Personal relationships fracture under the strain of secrecy. His actions resemble constant improvisation inside a system that never reaches equilibrium. The two heroes therefore inhabit different psychological scales. Superman moves within a framework that treats him as a stabilizing force for entire civilizations. His decisions operate at the level of global consequence. Even when he rescues a single individual, the symbolic weight of his presence suggests something larger. He embodies the possibility that order can exist beyond human fragility. Spider-Man operates at street level. His victories rarely feel definitive. One criminal is stopped while another rises. One life is saved while another slips beyond reach. The narrative rhythm of his world resists closure. Responsibility continues after every confrontation. It accumulates. These structural differences influence how each hero perceives failure. For Superman, failure threatens the stability of the entire symbolic order he represents. If the figure who stands above chaos loses control, the myth of invulnerability collapses. His greatest fear is not defeat in battle, but the moment when his own strength becomes a source of destruction. For Spider-Man, failure is already integrated into the narrative fabric. Loss appears regularly. Friends are endangered. Relationships dissolve under the weight of secrecy. The city never stops generating crises. The expectation is not perfection but endurance. The moral test is not whether he avoids failure, but whether he continues despite it. This creates two different psychological relationships with hope. Superman embodies hope as a stable structure that must be preserved. His presence reassures the world that catastrophe can be contained. Spider-Man embodies hope as persistence within uncertainty. His presence suggests that moral action remains possible even when outcomes remain fragile. Their enemies reveal this difference even more clearly. Superman often confronts adversaries who mirror his scale. Figures capable of threatening entire planets, ideologies that challenge the legitimacy of his restraint, technologies designed to destabilize global equilibrium. His conflicts resemble battles over the architecture of reality itself. Spider-Man's adversaries emerge from more intimate distortions. Scientists whose ambition fractures into obsession. Criminals whose personal grievances expand into elaborate revenge. Individuals who once stood within ordinary society, but have been reshaped by trauma, pride, or desperation. His conflicts resemble psychological spirals that spill into the city around them. Both heroes therefore function as reflections of their environments. Superman belongs to a world that still believes in structural coherence. Spider-Man belongs to a world where systems appear fragile and constantly renegotiated. Yet despite these differences, a strange symmetry exists between them. Each carries a burden that the other rarely experiences. Superman carries the weight of scale. Spider-Man carries the weight of proximity. Superman sees everything. His senses stretch across continents. Voices travel through his hearing from distant places. Crises appear simultaneously in multiple directions. His greatest challenge becomes selection. Which emergency deserves immediate attention? Which tragedy must be allowed to unfold, because intervention would create greater harm? Spider-Man sees almost nothing beyond his immediate environment. His field of action rarely extends beyond the boundaries of his city. Yet the closeness of that environment creates a different pressure. Every victim has a face. Every decision touches someone he knows. The scale is smaller, but the emotional intensity is sharper. In one sense, Superman lives above humanity while protecting it. Spider-Man lives inside humanity while struggling to protect it. This difference shapes how audiences experience them. Superman appears as aspiration, the image of what humanity wishes power could become. Calm, controlled, generous. Spider-Man appears as identification, the image of what responsibility feels like when life refuses to simplify. Yet when these two myths are placed side by side, an intriguing possibility emerges. Each contains something the other lacks. Superman's discipline risks isolation. The more perfectly he maintains control, the further he drifts from the messy immediacy of ordinary life. Spider-Man's intimacy risks exhaustion. The more closely he engages with every crisis, the more his personal identity erodes under constant pressure. One hero risks becoming too distant. The other risks becoming overwhelmed. Between them lies a silent question, a question that neither of their worlds asks directly, yet which becomes unavoidable once their stories begin to echo against one another. What if the figure who stands above the system learned to live inside it? And what if the figure who lives inside chaos learned, even briefly, how to rise above it? The tension between those possibilities becomes the beginning of a deeper psychological dialogue. one that does not require the heroes to meet physically in order to unfold, because myth operates through reflection as much as through collision. And when two myths occupy the same symbolic territory long enough, they begin to illuminate one another in ways their creators may never have anticipated. When the symbolic trajectories of Superman and Spider-Man begin to overlap in cultural imagination, the comparison does not arise from narrative crossover or editorial design. It emerges from a deeper structural curiosity. Audiences instinctively recognize that these two figures represent opposite vantage points within the architecture of heroism. One stands above the system and guards its stability. The other moves inside the system and absorbs its instability. The question that begins to surface is not which one is stronger. It is which perspective reveals something the other cannot see. Superman's vantage point is defined by altitude. Not merely the literal ability to fly, but the psychological altitude that accompanies it. From above the skyline, the city becomes pattern. Traffic flows resemble arteries. Power grids pulse like nervous systems. Disaster appears as disturbance within an otherwise coherent structure. The ability to perceive the world from this height creates a particular form of responsibility. Superman does not merely intervene in crises. He monitors equilibrium. This perspective allows him to prevent catastrophe before it becomes visible to ordinary citizens. A structural collapse detected through distant vibration. A military escalation overheard across oceans. A collision course calculated long before satellites issue warnings. The world becomes a system that can be stabilized through early intervention. His strength therefore operates like structural reinforcement applied before the fracture spreads. Yet altitude carries its own cost. The higher the vantage point, the more abstract human life can appear. When thousands of voices reach his hearing simultaneously, the emotional clarity of individual suffering risks dissolving into statistical noise. Superman resists this abstraction through discipline, through constant reminders of the small Kansas town that shaped him. Still, the tension remains. The larger his field of perception becomes, the more difficult it is to remain fully present within the fragile details of everyday existence. Spider-Man exists on the opposite end of that spectrum. His world rarely offers distance. The city presses against him from every direction. Sirens echo through narrow streets. Conversations travel through apartment windows. Conflicts unfold within reach of his hands rather than beyond the horizon. His powers allow him to navigate this density, yet they do not free him from it. Where Superman's senses extend outward across continents, Spider-Man's awareness intensifies the immediacy of danger. His reflexes anticipate impact seconds before it arrives. His movements adjust instantly to shifting environments. The web line attaches to the nearest structure, not the distant skyline. Everything occurs within arm's reach. Every mistake leaves immediate consequences. This proximity creates a different relationship with responsibility. Superman chooses where to intervene within a field of potential disasters. Spider-Man often discovers that the disaster has already begun before he can decide whether to engage. The system does not wait for his approval. It engulfs him. Consider the rhythm of their typical confrontations. When Superman faces a crisis, the scene often begins with revelation. The threat appears, its scale becomes visible, and the figure in the sky moves to restore structural balance. His arrival alters the equation instantly. Even enemies recognize that a stabilizing force has entered the arena. Spider-Man's confrontations rarely follow that pattern. Conflict usually emerges gradually from environments that already feel unstable. A robbery unfolds inside a crowded street. A scientist's experiment mutates into chaos inside a laboratory. A criminal scheme expands through networks that reach deep into the city's infrastructure. Spider-Man enters these situations while they are already unfolding. His presence intensifies the motion rather than freezing it. This difference between stabilization and entanglement reveals two distinct models of heroism. Superman represents control applied from outside the system. Spider-Man represents adaptation from within the system. Neither approach is inherently superior. Each solves problems the other would struggle to address. Superman's altitude allows him to intervene in crises whose scale would overwhelm any individual operating at street level. Meteor trajectories, alien invasions, weapons capable of destabilizing planetary ecosystems. His perspective transforms catastrophe into solvable geometry. Spider-Man's proximity allows him to perceive fractures invisible from above. The subtle desperation inside a criminal's voice. The moment when scientific curiosity begins sliding toward obsession. The fragile psychological pressure inside individuals who feel unseen by the larger structures of society. These details rarely appear on Superman's horizon until they have grown large enough to threaten entire cities. This contrast becomes even clearer when examining the emotional atmosphere surrounding their actions. Superman's presence often produces calm. Citizens look upward and feel reassured that a protective force exists beyond their own limitations. His arrival functions like architectural reinforcement within the symbolic structure of society. The world feels less fragile when he is visible. Spider-Man's presence produces a different emotional effect. He does not descend from the sky like a stabilizing monument. He bursts into motion. Web lines snap against steel beams. Bodies swing through narrow spaces. Dialogue emerges mid-movement, half humor and half tension. The scene becomes kinetic. Rather than calming the environment, Spider-Man often intensifies its volatility before resolving it. This dynamic reveals something about how each hero processes fear. Superman confronts fear through containment. He absorbs the energy of crisis and converts it into order. Spider-Man confronts fear through momentum. He moves faster than the anxiety can paralyze him. Yet inside these patterns lies an unspoken limitation for each. Superman's discipline, while essential to maintaining global stability, risks isolating him from the emotional texture of ordinary life. His ability to solve problems quickly can create distance between himself and the messy process through which humans learn to navigate those problems. In saving the world repeatedly, he sometimes becomes a figure who belongs more to myth than to daily existence. Spider-Man faces the opposite danger. His constant proximity to crisis threatens to consume the personal life that once defined him. The responsibilities of heroism bleed into friendships, work, and love. Every decision to protect others erodes the fragile balance required to sustain his own identity. The hero becomes entangled in the very system he tries to stabilize. This is where the symbolic dialogue between them begins to deepen. Imagine Superman observing Spider-Man's world not from the sky, but from within the city itself. The constant improvisation, the endless negotiation between personal life and public duty. The emotional immediacy of each rescue. He might recognize something missing from his own perspective. A reminder that responsibility is not always measured by scale but by presence. And imagine Spider-Man witnessing Superman's ability to step back from chaos and see the entire structure at once. The calm required to assess global threats without panic. The discipline that allows power to remain steady rather than reactive. He might glimpse something equally valuable. The possibility that distance, when used wisely, can prevent exhaustion. Neither hero was designed to embody both perspectives. Their narratives were built around different symbolic roles. Yet the comparison between them reveals an unexpected tension. Superman must constantly resist becoming too distant from the human world he protects. Spider-Man must constantly resist becoming overwhelmed by the human world he inhabits. Between them lies a psychological middle ground that neither story fully explores on its own. A place where power is balanced by perspective. Where strength does not erase vulnerability, but neither does vulnerability erase strength. This middle ground becomes visible only when their myths begin to reflect one another. And once that reflection appears, the contrast between altitude and proximity stops feeling like simple difference. It begins to resemble a fracture in the architecture of modern heroism itself. Once the contrast between altitude and proximity becomes visible, the dialogue between these two mythic figures begins to deepen. The difference is no longer simply a matter of environment or scale. It begins to reveal a deeper structural tension about how power interacts with human limits. Superman's story assumes that power must remain disciplined in order to protect the world from collapse. Spider-Man's story assumes that power inevitably collides with personal life and fractures it. At first glance, the difference appears straightforward. Superman represents control. Spider-Man represents struggle. Yet as their narratives accumulate across decades, the apparent simplicity of this contrast begins to unravel. Control and struggle are not separate categories. They are stages of the same psychological process. One hero simply begins where the other already lives. Superman's calm is not natural. It is constructed. Every moment of restraint requires constant negotiation with the immense force contained inside him. His ability to move continents, halt tidal waves, or bend steel with minimal effort creates a permanent risk. If discipline falters even briefly, destruction would follow. The world experiences Superman as stable precisely because he has already fought the internal battle that Spider-Man faces publicly. The difference is timing. Superman learned to regulate his power before it became part of his public identity. The quiet lessons of Kansas allowed him to shape instinct into structure. When the world first saw him lift an airplane from the sky, the internal architecture required to manage that strength had already been built. Spider-Man entered the opposite sequence. Power arrived first. Structure came later. Peter Parker discovered his abilities without preparation and immediately faced a world that demanded moral decisions faster than he could understand them. The death of Uncle Ben forced responsibility into his life before discipline had time to mature. From that moment onward, his story unfolds as a constant effort to catch up with the consequences of power already in motion. This creates an important psychological asymmetry between them. Superman experiences restraint as a natural extension of identity. Spider-Man experiences restraint as a lesson learned through failure. Both arrive at responsibility, but the emotional path differs. One grows into it gradually. The other is pushed toward it through loss. This divergence becomes particularly visible when examining how each hero relates to guilt. For Superman, guilt appears as a distant threat, something that must be avoided through careful judgment. When catastrophe occurs despite his intervention, the question becomes whether he miscalculated. Did he act too late? Did he prioritize the wrong crisis? His guilt emerges from the tension between infinite capacity and the impossibility of saving everyone. Spider-Man's guilt is far more intimate. It is anchored to a specific moment in time, a moment when action was possible and not taken. That memory does not fade. It becomes the axis around which his entire moral universe rotates. Every decision echoes against it. Responsibility is not simply a principle. It is a form of repayment. This difference alters how each hero moves through conflict. Superman approaches danger as a problem that must be stabilized. His calm is not indifference but concentration. He calculates trajectories, anticipates structural collapse, and intervenes with precision designed to restore equilibrium. His emotional distance allows him to operate on scales that would overwhelm a more reactive mind. Spider-Man approaches danger as something already entangled with his personal life. The villain may have once been a mentor. The catastrophe may involve people he knows. The city itself feels like an extension of his daily existence. His responses carry emotional velocity. Humor becomes a tool for maintaining psychological balance under constant pressure. Yet the deeper their stories unfold, the more each hero begins to reveal a blind spot that the other naturally compensates for. Superman's restraint can become isolation. The more carefully he maintains control, the more distant he risks becoming from the everyday texture of the society he protects. His perspective expands to planetary scale, but the emotional immediacy of individual lives can fade into abstraction. When the world sees him in the sky, it feels safe, yet he himself often stands alone above the system he stabilizes. Spider-Man experiences the opposite problem. His closeness to the world creates relentless emotional exposure. Every crisis carries personal weight. Friends are endangered. Relationships collapse under the burden of secrecy. The city never stops demanding his attention. His life becomes a series of sacrifices made in order to prevent suffering he can see directly. One hero risks becoming detached from the people he protects. The other risks being consumed by them. This contrast produces a subtle but powerful form of symbolic tension. Each hero embodies a solution to a problem the other struggles to solve. Superman demonstrates that immense power can remain compassionate when guided by discipline. Spider-Man demonstrates that moral responsibility can survive even when life refuses to become stable. Together they form two halves of a larger psychological model of heroism. Strength without empathy becomes tyranny. Empathy without perspective becomes exhaustion. The audience senses this relationship even when the characters never meet. Readers who grow up with Superman learn to believe that the world can be protected by forces greater than themselves. Readers who grow up with Spider-Man learn that protection often begins with ordinary individuals who choose responsibility despite overwhelming pressure. These lessons operate simultaneously within the cultural imagination. One myth offers reassurance, the other offers recognition. Yet the dialogue between them does not remain theoretical. Over time, both characters begin to evolve in ways that subtly approach the territory occupied by the other. Superman's stories increasingly explore the difficulty of remaining emotionally connected to humanity while possessing godlike power. Writers place him in situations where brute strength cannot resolve the deeper conflict. Moral dilemmas emerge that require empathy rather than force. The hero who once stabilized disasters must now confront the emotional consequences of being perceived as something beyond human understanding. Spider-Man's stories, meanwhile, gradually expand his capacity for leadership and strategic thinking. The teenager who once stumbled through crises begins to develop perspective. He learns to anticipate danger rather than simply react to it. Experience transforms improvisation into insight. The hero who once survived chaos begins to influence the structure of the world around him. These evolutions reveal something unexpected. The longer their myths continue, the more each hero begins to approach the psychological territory originally occupied by the other. Superman seeks deeper emotional intimacy with the human world. Spider-Man seeks greater clarity and composure within it. Their narratives start from opposite ends of the same spectrum and slowly move toward a shared middle ground. In that space, the question of what they might learn from one another becomes more than speculation. It becomes a lens through which the architecture of modern heroism can be examined. Because the tension between distance and proximity, control and struggle, discipline and improvisation, is not limited to fictional characters. It reflects a universal human challenge. How does one carry responsibility without becoming isolated? How does one remain connected to others without becoming overwhelmed by their suffering? Superman and Spider-Man approach these questions from different directions, yet the answers they discover begin to converge. Not through direct interaction, but through the slow accumulation of narrative experience. And as their stories continue to unfold across generations, the symbolic conversation between them grows more complex. Each hero begins to illuminate the hidden limits of the other. and the myth of heroism itself becomes less about power, more about perspective. As the symbolic conversation between Superman and Spider-Man deepens, a new layer of tension emerges. The comparison is no longer limited to responsibility or emotional proximity. It begins to expose a deeper structural question about identity itself. What happens to a person when the world turns them into a symbol? Both heroes eventually reach a point where their personal lives and their mythic roles begin to collide. Not violently, but through a slow accumulation of expectations. Society begins to see them less as individuals and more as functions within a moral system. The hero becomes infrastructure, a living pillar that supports the psychological architecture of the world around him. Superman confronts this transformation early. The moment he reveals himself publicly, the planet reorganizes its sense of security around his existence. Governments measure their strategies against his presence. Citizens project hope onto his silhouette in the sky. Enemies design weapons specifically to challenge his authority. The man who grew up in quiet farmland becomes a global axis of expectation. This elevation brings with it a dangerous illusion. The world begins to treat Superman as if he belongs above humanity rather than among it. Every rescue reinforces the perception that he exists outside ordinary limits. Gradually, the symbol threatens to eclipse the person who inhabits it. Clark Kent becomes the fragile counterweight to this process. Inside the newsroom of the Daily Planet, he can observe humanity without the gravitational distortion created by his powers. The timid reporter moves through the city unnoticed, listening to conversations that would change if the world believed Superman was present. This dual existence preserves a critical psychological boundary. Without it, the symbol would consume the man. Spider-Man experiences a similar transformation, but through a far more chaotic route. His public identity never receives the same universal admiration. The city does not unanimously celebrate him. Newspapers accuse him of reckless interference. Criminal organizations place bounties on his capture. Citizens debate whether he is hero or menace. This unstable public image creates a different form of pressure. Peter Parker must sustain the hero while simultaneously defending his legitimacy. The mask protects his personal life, but it also traps him inside a reputation he cannot control. Every action becomes subject to interpretation by a city that rarely sees the whole picture. Over time, this produces a psychological paradox. Spider-Man becomes more famous as a symbol than Peter Parker ever could as a person. Yet the symbol often receives blame rather than gratitude. The hero is visible everywhere, swinging between skyscrapers under the constant gaze of cameras and witnesses. The individual behind the mask remains invisible even to those he loves. In both cases, the hero confronts the same structural tension. The symbol grows larger than the person who created it. Superman responds by reinforcing the quiet humanity of Clark Kent. Spider-Man responds by deepening the emotional resilience of Peter Parker. Their strategies differ, yet the goal is identical. Preserve the human center that prevents the myth from becoming empty spectacle. This struggle becomes particularly visible when examining how each hero navigates relationships. Superman's connections to others are shaped by the awareness that his power can never fully disappear from the equation. Even moments of intimacy carry the shadow of what he represents. Friends trust him, allies respect him, yet a subtle distance often remains. The knowledge that he could alter the physical structure of the world with a single decision creates a silent boundary that ordinary human relationships rarely cross. Spider-Man faces the opposite dilemma. His relationships suffer not because of overwhelming power, but because of constant absence. The city interrupts everything. Dates end abruptly when sirens echo through nearby streets. Jobs disappear because emergencies require immediate departure. Friends struggle to understand why Peter Parker repeatedly vanishes when stability finally seems possible. The result is a life lived between two gravitational pulls. Personal connection on one side, responsibility on the other. Both heroes attempt to balance these forces. Both repeatedly fail. Superman sometimes withdraws emotionally in order to maintain the clarity required by his global responsibilities. Spider-Man sometimes sacrifices personal stability because the city demands intervention faster than his life can accommodate it. These patterns reveal the deeper psychological cost of becoming a symbol. The world sees the hero as stable. The individual inside the role experiences constant negotiation. Yet despite these pressures, neither hero abandons the responsibility that defines him. The reason lies not in obligation alone, but in identity. Over time, the act of protecting others becomes inseparable from their sense of self. To stop would feel like erasing the moral architecture that gives their lives coherence. This is where the symbolic dialogue between them reaches its most revealing point. Superman demonstrates that identity can survive immense power when anchored to humility and restraint. Spider-Man demonstrates that identity can survive relentless pressure when anchored to persistence and empathy. One hero protects the world by maintaining distance from its chaos. The other protects the world by remaining immersed within it. Both strategies reveal strengths. Both expose vulnerabilities. Superman's distance can create moments where humanity perceives him as something unreachable, almost divine. Spider-Man's immersion can trap him inside cycles of sacrifice that leave little room for personal growth. Placed side by side, their stories begin to resemble complementary responses to the same existential problem. How does a person remain human while carrying responsibilities larger than human life normally allows? Superman answers by preserving the quiet lessons of his upbringing, allowing the memory of small-town humility to regulate cosmic power. Spider-Man answers by refusing to surrender empathy, even when life repeatedly punishes his attempts to do the right thing. Each hero embodies a form of endurance. Superman endures the burden of scale. Spider-Man endures the burden of proximity. Yet the longer these myths evolve, the more clearly their limitations become visible. Superman's perspective risks becoming too elevated to fully understand the daily pressures shaping human behavior. Spider-Man's perspective risks becoming so entangled with those pressures that long-term vision becomes difficult. Between them lies an unoccupied perspective, a position that combines altitude with empathy, clarity with intimacy, strength with vulnerability. The symbolic question that emerges is simple but profound. What would happen if each hero briefly inhabited the world as the other experiences it? If Superman felt the constant immediacy of responsibility pressing against ordinary life? If Spider-Man experienced the calm distance required to see the entire structure of the world at once? The answer is not found through direct encounter. It emerges gradually through the way audiences compare their stories across decades. Readers begin to recognize that heroism does not exist in a single form. It evolves depending on where one stands within the system being protected. The hero in the sky and the hero in the streets are not rivals. They are different responses to the same moral pressure. And the lessons they offer one another reveal something fundamental about the architecture of responsibility itself. Power alone cannot sustain a hero. Perspective must accompany it. Without perspective, strength becomes blind. Without strength, perspective becomes helpless. The dialogue between Superman and Spider-Man exposes that balance with unusual clarity. Two myths built on different foundations, slowly illuminating the same truth from opposite directions. Once the comparison between Superman and Spider-Man leaves the terrain of narrative structure and enters the wider field of cultural imagination, the meaning of their contrast expands dramatically. These characters no longer function only as protagonists inside fictional events. They become symbolic instruments through which societies examine their relationship with power, responsibility, and moral expectation. Their differences begin to shape how entire generations imagine what a hero is allowed to be. Superman occupies a position close to the center of the heroic myth in modern culture. His silhouette against the sky has become one of the most recognizable symbolic images produced by 20th century storytelling. The figure who lifts objects far heavier than the human body should sustain, who hears cries from distant continents and arrives in time to prevent catastrophe, represents a fantasy deeply embedded in the psychological structure of collective life. It is the fantasy that strength might exist somewhere beyond the reach of corruption. The world that surrounds Superman is therefore shaped by projection. People project hope onto him, but they also project fear, suspicion, admiration, and resentment. His presence alters the symbolic environment in which politics, technology, and morality operate. The simple knowledge that someone capable of halting global catastrophe exists above the atmosphere reshapes how the public imagines safety and vulnerability. This projection creates an unusual cultural tension. Superman represents the possibility of absolute power that chooses restraint. Yet absolute power has historically rarely behaved that way. The contradiction between these two ideas gives the character his enduring symbolic weight. He becomes a test case for a question that extends far beyond fiction. Can immense power remain benevolent when nothing outside it can impose limits? Spider-Man occupies a very different symbolic territory. His image does not hover above society as an unreachable ideal. It moves through the same spaces ordinary people inhabit. Subway entrances, apartment rooftops, crowded streets. The city itself becomes the stage where his actions unfold. This proximity changes the emotional relationship between hero and audience. When people look at Superman, they see aspiration. When they look at Spider-Man, they see reflection. The hero who swings through the city is visibly vulnerable. He bleeds. He makes mistakes. He arrives late. His victories rarely eliminate the conditions that produced the crisis in the first place. Crime persists. Personal loss accumulates. The system never becomes stable, yet he continues moving through it. This pattern resonates with audiences because it mirrors everyday experience more closely than the calm certainty associated with Superman's presence. Life rarely provides perfect resolution. Responsibilities multiply. Failures occur despite good intentions. The figure who keeps returning to the struggle, even after repeated setbacks, begins to resemble the internal narrative many people use to understand their own lives. These symbolic positions influence the way each character circulates through culture. Superman appears as the emblem of hope in its most architectural form. Governments invoke him during moments when collective reassurance becomes necessary. Political speeches reference his image when describing moral leadership. His symbol functions almost like a flag representing the belief that integrity can survive inside systems of power. Spider-Man circulates differently. His story is invoked when discussing resilience rather than authority. Teachers reference him when explaining responsibility to younger audiences. Writers and filmmakers use his narrative as shorthand for the idea that ethical choices often carry personal cost. His mask becomes a symbol of ordinary individuals who choose action even when recognition remains uncertain. The contrast between them creates a symbolic ecosystem. One figure stabilizes the horizon of what power might achieve at its best. The other grounds heroism inside the unpredictable terrain of everyday life. Together they construct a cultural dialogue about how responsibility operates at different scales. This dialogue becomes particularly visible when examining how audiences debate the meaning of heroism itself. In discussions about Superman, the conversation often revolves around restraint. The central question becomes how someone with near limitless strength avoids dominating the world he protects. The hero is judged by his ability to refuse power rather than by his ability to exercise it. In discussions about Spider-Man, the focus shifts toward endurance. The question becomes how someone who repeatedly loses stability continues to protect others anyway. The hero is judged not by the absence of weakness, but by the refusal to abandon responsibility. These debates reveal something deeper about modern culture. Societies no longer accept a single model of moral authority. The 20th and 21st centuries have produced widespread skepticism toward institutions that claim absolute legitimacy. In such an environment, the calm certainty embodied by Superman can feel distant, almost utopian. Yet the persistent struggle embodied by Spider-Man feels recognizable. At the same time, the cultural imagination resists abandoning Superman's model entirely. Even the most skeptical societies retain a desire to believe that integrity can survive inside positions of immense power. The figure in the sky becomes a symbolic reassurance that authority might still serve something larger than itself. The coexistence of these two myths therefore mirrors a larger cultural tension. People want heroes who are strong enough to stabilize the world, yet human enough to understand the fragile lives that inhabit it. Superman represents the hope that moral clarity can guide overwhelming power. Spider-Man represents the belief that moral action can persist even without overwhelming power. Together they shape the psychological expectations audiences carry into discussions about leadership, responsibility, and social duty. When people evaluate real-world figures who wield influence, the symbolic echoes of these myths often appear beneath the surface. Leaders are praised when they demonstrate the restraint associated with Superman. They are admired when they show the perseverance associated with Spider-Man. This influence extends beyond politics or public life. It shapes how individuals imagine their own capacity for responsibility. Some people aspire to the calm authority associated with Superman's presence. Others resonate with the idea that responsibility emerges through struggle rather than perfection. In both cases, the characters function as cultural mirrors reflecting the tension between aspiration and experience. The media environment amplifies this dynamic. Every new film adaptation, comic storyline, or television portrayal reframes the symbolic conversation between them. Visual technology allows audiences to experience Superman's altitude more vividly than ever before, watching him move through clouds above entire cities. At the same time, cinematic storytelling places viewers directly inside Spider-Man's motion, swinging between buildings as the city rushes past at street level. These visual perspectives reinforce the psychological difference embedded in their myths. One camera angle looks downward from the sky. The other moves horizontally through crowded spaces. Even the way audiences physically see the world while watching these characters reflects their symbolic positions. Over time, this persistent contrast shapes how heroism itself is defined within popular culture. A hero can be the stabilizing force that holds the system together. A hero can also be the individual who refuses to surrender when the system fails. Superman and Spider-Man do not compete for this definition. They expand it. By occupying opposite ends of the symbolic spectrum, they reveal that responsibility can operate through many forms of strength. Authority, persistence, distance, empathy. The cultural conversation that emerges from their coexistence becomes richer than either myth could produce alone. Each hero exposes the limitations of the other, while simultaneously reinforcing the importance of his perspective. Superman reminds the world that power must be guided by discipline. Spider-Man reminds the world that discipline must remain connected to lived experience. Between them, a more complex vision of heroism takes shape, one that recognizes the need for both altitude and proximity, both stability and struggle, both myth and humanity. And as long as these two figures continue to occupy the cultural imagination, their silent dialogue will keep shaping how societies understand the burden of responsibility, not as a single heroic posture, but as a spectrum of moral positions through which individuals attempt to hold the world together. When the long arc of these two myths is viewed from a distance, the most striking realization is that Superman and Spider-Man were never designed to answer the same question. They emerged from different historical pressures, different cultural anxieties, and different narrative traditions. Yet over time their coexistence has produced something neither character alone could sustain. Together they form a symbolic map of responsibility within modern storytelling. Superman stands at the horizon of that map. His presence establishes the outer boundary of what heroism can represent. A figure who possesses extraordinary power, yet refuses domination, becomes a cultural experiment. His existence asks whether moral clarity can remain intact when every structural advantage belongs to the individual holding it. The image of Superman hovering above a city does not merely represent strength. It represents the possibility that strength might remain aligned with restraint. This alignment is the core of his legacy. Superman stabilizes the imagination of power. In a world repeatedly confronted with evidence that authority can become predatory, the myth of a figure who refuses to exploit his advantage continues to function as symbolic resistance. It asserts that power, when anchored to humility, can serve rather than consume. Yet the very perfection of this model carries a subtle risk. Superman's composure can appear distant from the unpredictable texture of human life. When people witness a hero who almost never loses control, who rarely arrives too late, whose moral compass remains steady under unimaginable pressure, the figure can drift toward abstraction. He becomes less a reflection of humanity and more a standard humanity struggles to reach. Spider-Man occupies the opposite pole of that symbolic terrain. His legacy emerges not from the stabilization of power, but from the endurance of responsibility under unstable conditions. Peter Parker does not begin as a figure capable of saving the world from above. He begins as someone who fails, learns, and returns to the struggle despite repeated personal cost. This persistence becomes the core of Spider-Man's cultural meaning. His story suggests that responsibility is not reserved for those who possess perfect discipline or extraordinary clarity. It can emerge from ordinary individuals who discover, often too late, that their choices carry consequences far beyond the moment in which they were made. Where Superman reassures audiences that power can remain benevolent, Spider-Man reassures them that imperfection does not eliminate the possibility of moral action. These two legacies do not cancel each other. They reinforce each other by occupying different layers of the same symbolic system. Superman defines the upper limit of what ethical power might achieve. Spider-Man defines the ground level where ethical struggle actually occurs. Between them lies the terrain where most human lives unfold. This layered structure explains why the cultural fascination with both characters has endured across generations. Each hero addresses a different psychological need. In moments when society feels overwhelmed by instability, the calm certainty embodied by Superman becomes especially powerful. The image of a stabilizing force above the chaos provides reassurance that the system might still hold. In moments when individuals feel trapped within responsibilities they never asked to carry, the persistence embodied by Spider-Man becomes equally powerful. The young hero swinging through exhaustion, balancing personal loss with the determination to protect others, reflects the experience of people who continue acting responsibly even when life refuses to simplify. Their coexistence therefore produces a symbolic equilibrium. Superman reminds the world what moral authority might look like if it were perfectly disciplined. Spider-Man reminds the world what moral courage looks like when discipline must be built through failure. When audiences place these two figures side by side, an unexpected insight begins to emerge. Each hero contains a lesson the other quietly lacks. Superman, for all his compassion, occasionally risks appearing detached from the daily pressure that shapes human choices. His altitude grants clarity, but that clarity can sometimes obscure the complexity of life lived within limited power. Spider-Man's experience inside constant struggle reveals something Superman's perspective can overlook. Responsibility often begins long before strength is sufficient to handle it. Spider-Man, on the other hand, sometimes risks becoming trapped inside endless reaction. The city generates crises faster than he can solve them. Personal sacrifice accumulates without producing permanent stability. Superman's composure reveals something Spider-Man's perspective can overlook. Without moments of distance and structural clarity, responsibility can consume the individual attempting to carry it. Seen through this lens, the symbolic dialogue between them begins to resemble a balancing mechanism within the mythology of modern heroism. Superman represents the necessity of perspective. Spider-Man represents the necessity of empathy. Perspective without empathy produces cold authority. Empathy without perspective produces burnout. The cultural imagination instinctively understands this balance, even when the characters themselves never meet. Readers absorb the lessons of both myths simultaneously. The figure in the sky offers a vision of disciplined strength. The figure in the streets offers a vision of resilient humanity. Together they reveal that heroism cannot exist in a single posture. Sometimes it requires the calm ability to see the entire structure of the world and intervene before collapse begins. Sometimes it requires the stubborn willingness to continue protecting others, even when the structure itself refuses to stabilize. The legacy of Superman and Spider-Man therefore extends beyond the boundaries of their fictional universes. They function as complementary myths through which modern culture negotiates its understanding of responsibility. One myth insists that power must be restrained by conscience. The other insists that conscience must survive even when power feels insufficient. Their stories never truly conclude. New interpretations continue to reshape them, placing the same symbolic figures into new historical moments. The skyline changes. The city evolves. Technologies alter the scale of both catastrophe and rescue, yet the fundamental tension they embody remains intact. Human societies continue searching for figures who can stabilize the world without dominating it. They continue admiring individuals who carry responsibility even when the cost becomes personal. Superman and Spider-Man endure because they represent those two aspirations in their purest narrative forms. One stands above the horizon, reminding the world that strength guided by restraint can hold chaos at bay. The other moves through the crowded streets, reminding the world that responsibility lived day by day can prevent despair from becoming permanent. Neither myth alone captures the full complexity of heroism. Together they reveal its structure, a balance between altitude and proximity, between clarity and struggle, between the dream of perfect responsibility and the reality of imperfect lives that continue trying to live up to it.